Hello and welcome to a new video. In this video, I will show you how to install the new ESXi 8.0 hypervisor in your computer or server to start your own virtualization server for free. We will also dig deeper into all the features available in the ESXi free version. First, grab the link from the description box where you can find the free ESXi URL on the VMware website. If this is the first time you come here, you might need to register to be able to get the free license key to use with the product. And then all you need to do is to download the ISO file so you can install the VMware hypervisor in your system. This ISO file I will use internally on my PC. After the ISO file, we need also the Rufus tool to be able to make a bootable USB drive from this ISO file. So I'm just gonna download the portable version to be able to burn this ISO file into my USB flash drive. Now, Rufus is very simple. You just define the ISO file that you need to burn, where the operating system is, and choose the flash drive. And as simple as a few clicks, Rufus will start copy all these files to the flash drive. Now, before you install the flash drive in your computer, make sure to get into the BIOS settings to enable two settings that we need for this video. I found this good article on the Informative website where it shows you pictures or step by step on how to enable the BIOS settings for virtualization. So the first option is the Intel virtualization technology or the AMD equivalent. And this would allow you to run virtual machines in general in your operating system. And then the VTD is an option that allows the PCI pass-through for the GPU or other devices. Once both options are enabled, all you need to do is to insert the USB flash drive in your computer or server and boot from the USB flash drive. The ESXi installer is very simple, very similar to the last version. And will also ask you to choose the hard disk where do you want the hypervisor to be installed. And finally, the root password is very important because that's what we need to log into the system. Once I enter all these required information, it will ask me to format the disk and start the install. Once we agree to that, just a few seconds and we should be able to use the system. Once we reboot, we will get this message that shows us which IP address and which protocol to use to access the system. So I use my browser to access 10.1.10.10, which is the IP address shown on the hypervisor. And this will be the ESXi host client. This is the first visual different from the previous version. As you see, they have a new UI for the login, very similar to the one in their website. So I will be using root and the password I created during the installation to log into the system. And of course, I will opt out from giving my information to the experience improvement program. And as you see in here, this is the ESXi host client that shows us all the information regarding the hypervisor. We have our 16 gigs from all the CPU cores together as the CPU frequency. We have the memory of 32 gigs and we have the 337 gigs left out of the 500 gig SSD. Now we will look into storage later, but if we scroll down, you'll see in here the CPU information. This is a 7700K, 32 gigs of RAM. And this is the interface we are using to manage the ESXi host, 10.1.10.10. These are our DNS servers and the router IP address or the default gateway. Now the network we are using in here, or the default network, it's called the VM network. We will talk about networking very soon. And very similarly for the storage, we have our only data store for the SSD. This is the actual partition where we will be storing virtual machines. And finally, we have here this symbol graph where it shows you the CPU usage. Right now, we don't have any VMs running, so everything looks very quiet. So now let's leave this summary page and let's go to Manage. So under Manage, you have some advanced settings for flags you can change in the configuration. You have auto start VMs, which is a useful feature. You can allow important applications that run in specific VMs to run when the ESXi host reboots. So if your hypervisor reboots for updates or for any issue, you want to put your important virtual machines in here for automatic startup. Now under hardware, you can see all the hardware details in your system. Things like the GPU that we have installed in the system here, the GTX 1060. You can enable the pass-through, which we're gonna do later. You can also check other devices like the wireless card. So in here, you will see all the hardware devices and how you can manage them. Now under licensing, this is where you have all the features for free for 2 months, or you can just use the free license that was given to you on the website. So I want to make sure I license my product first to make sure it doesn't run into issues later with licensing. And for this, I will head back into the VMware website. I'll grab one of the serial numbers and I will assign the license from here. And as you see now, my expiration date is never and my product is good to go. Now under packages, you can install VIPs or vSphere installation bundles if you have any. You can also be using this for offline updates. And finally, under security and users, you can see all the authentication and identity settings, including the Active Directory domain join, certificates if you'd like to generate a new certificate to use to manage the system, or create more local users to use in the system. You'll see in here there are basic rules that are included in the system like admin, read only, or access but without cryptography, different access levels for your different use cases. We don't need to add any additional users as of now, so I'm just gonna jump into the monitor pages. Under monitor pages, you can see all the specs for the CPU, including the load on each of the CPU cores. You can also change the metrics in here from CPU to memory usage, or network bandwidth, or even disk read and write ops. So this is very useful. It's hard to find out the actual specs right now before we start running VMs, but this is very comprehensive and nice tool to see all the usage over time in the hypervisor. Also under events, you can see things like syslog messages and changes in the system. So now let's move into storage. A storage would have all the information about your hard disk and all the provision partition. So as you see in here, the data store or the partition required for virtual machine hosting called data store 1. It's running the VMware file system version 6. One very useful feature we have from here is that we can directly have access to the data store browser. What you can do in here, you can start uploading ISO files that you can use later to deploy virtual machines. I'll create a directory and call it ISO files. So I will upload this Ubuntu server first. I will also upload the Linux Mint with the GUI. And now we have both ISO files uploaded in the data store. This will make it very smooth to deploy virtual machines from them later in this video. Now let's go back to storage and let's look into devices. As you see in here, I'm using this 500 gig SSD. And if you are wondering where is the rest of the space, that's because we have some partitions for caching and for boot, EFI system, and other system partitions. So all of them are used first, and then we have the remaining 337 to deploy our virtual machines. So if this space is not big enough, you can go back and install additional hard disk. For example, I have in here the 1 terabyte hard disk, which is not SSD, so it should be slower than the regular SSD. However, I can use this disk as additional storage in case I run out of storage later by coming into the device in here and creating a new data store. This one, I will give it a unique name, non-SSD, to make sure I don't use it unless I run out of the SSD space. As you see in here, we're gonna move this to use the full disk. So this will format the whole terabyte disk as the VMware file system as well. And that's the simplest way to format additional disk to use as the data store. So now this is all the information I want to show you in the storage section. Now we can go into virtual machine and start deploying the first virtual machine. So let's go ahead and create register VM. This is very similar to the VMware workstation process. You just create a new virtual machine. So let's start with the Linux Mint. I will choose the OS family for this Linux Mint as Linux. Let's see if there is a specific entry in here for Linux Mint. If not, we can simply choose other 5.x Linux, which is the kernel version, or other Linux 64. I will just choose the 5.x Linux 64-bit. And then in here, you will see which storage that you need to install the virtual machine into. I will choose everything as the data store 1 in this video. And now for the customization settings. So in here, we are able to modify the CPU, the memory, and add additional devices if necessary. So I will choose 4 CPUs for this virtual machine since it has a GUI and it has a little bit of graphics. And also for the memory, I will change it to maybe 6 gigs. And that's for the memory and CPU. Now for the hard disk, you can also increase the space if necessary. I will give it maybe 35 gigs for this hard disk. And now for the network, if we try to modify the network in here, unlike the VMware workstation where we had the option to run bridge, host only or NAT, in this case we have the only network VM network in here. I'll show you later how to customize this, but for now this is the only option we have for networking. Now, as far as the CD DVD drive, here we can hook it up directly to the data store ISO file. And under ISO files, I will choose the Linux Mint ISO. Now for the video card, if you would like to increase the specs a little bit, you can modify the settings. Maybe give it a 256 megabyte for the graphics. But later in this video, I will show you how to do the GPU pass-through, which is more advanced to the settings. Now I'll just go ahead and click next and finish deploying the VM. So this is our first VM. This is Linux Mint. You'll see in here very nice and clean UI for the virtual machine. So let's go ahead and start the virtual machine. As you see in here, it runs inside this windowed box. You can do a little bit of resizing in here, like putting it in the corner. You can also minimize it to the bottom, or you can actually maximize it to a full screen view using this button in here. As of now, we don't have any driver or OpenVM tools for displaying the screen correctly, so that's why you see it like in a smaller box. So now all we need to do is to verify the IP address first. So let's open up the terminal and let's do the IPA command. So as you see in here, this is running on the IP address 10.1.10.18. So the problem with using the same IP address is that we are literally hosting virtual machines in the same network as the hypervisor. So this is not very good security practice because it allows any VM in our network to basically have access to the hypervisor as well, and with weak credentials or no password at all or any issue, you are exposing the hypervisor to more security risk. So for this, I want to start going into the networking portion, and I want to show you a few techniques and design scenarios that you can use in real life. So let's minimize this VM for now, and let's go into networking. And in networking, you see in here the management network where the managing ESXi happens, and the VM network where the actual VMs are running. So one technique we can do is we can isolate all the virtual machines that we have in the VM network using a VLAN ID. We can also create additional port groups or additional VLANs for additional segregation between the individual VMs. So for that, I want to move into my router and I show you how we can set up the VLANs very quickly, and then we come back and replicate everything in here. So in my router, I have here my DMZ interface or the lab interface where the server is running. The IP address for this interface is 10.1.10.1. So this is the default gateway for the ESXi server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create additional VLAN interfaces. This one will be my VM zone 1, and it will be a VLAN interface. We'll segregate it with the VLAN ID number 115. For the IP address, we need to define a unique IP address for this network, since we don't want to use the 10.1.10 network for the VMs. So I will use 192.168.115.1/24. So this way the VLAN ID would match the third number in the IP address. And then I will also make sure I can enable DHCP server on my interface. This way users can access and get IP addresses from the DHCP server. And it's important to choose the interface as well, the lab DMZ. And this will be my first interface or first sub-interface under the lab. So I will also create one more additional interface for interface VM zone 2. This one will be under the lab interface as well. And I will give it the VLAN ID 125 this time. So the IP address will be 192.168.125.1/24. We'll also enable the DHCP server so clients can get an IP address. And now we have our two VLANs under the server, one with the VLAN 115 tag and one with the VLAN 125 tag. So now the first modification we can do is we can go into the actual VM network and modify the VLAN ID in here to match what we set up in the router side. So I'm gonna go ahead and edit the settings. I'll go into the VM network and I'll change the VLAN ID in here to 115 to segregate the traffic of the virtual machine from the management traffic. So now in order for us to verify this, let's go back to the virtual machine. Let's go into the Ethernet connection and let's turn it off. And then wait a few seconds and let's turn it on again and see which IP address will it get. So as I did the IPA again, it still didn't get an IP address. So one way we can force it to get an IP address is to run the DHCP client. And for this, I will run the sudo dhclient-v and then specify the interface name, which is ENS34. And as you see, the IP address I got is now 192.168.115.2. So using this VLAN isolation is very simple. All you need to do is to define a VLAN ID on the VM network. So now let me show you how you can create additional networks using the ESXi networking. So I'll go back to networking. Let's minimize this as well. In order for us to add additional VLANs, we just need to add ESXi port group. So for this port group, I will call it zone 2 to match the name I choose in the router side. I will use the VLAN ID 125. So as simple as that, we have additional port groups. Each of these VLANs cannot talk to each other without going through the router, which we can control the traffic using a firewall. If we also want to replicate this on the Linux Mint machine, we can simply come here, modify the system again. But instead of the VM network, we can change the interface to the zone 2. So we're going to be selecting the zone 2 as the interface. Now under the Linux Mint again, we'll turn it off the wired connection and then turn it on again. And using the DH client, let's clear the messages first and let's run the DH client again. As you see in here, the request that came out of the computer was for 192.168.115.2, which was the older IP address on the VLAN 115. However, the router responded back with a different DHCP offer for 192.168.125.2, which is from the correct new VLAN. And that's how you segregate VMs with VLAN IDs and different VLAN setups. And now I will jump into the GPU pass-through. You should be able to come in the hardware section and be able to find your NVIDIA or whatever GPU you are using. By simply selecting it, it will select the audio and the video portion, and you just choose toggle pass-through. And this way, you should be able to see pass-through active. You can also do this with additional chips as well, like the wireless chip. However, I just want to experiment with the GPU. Now we can do one of two setups. We can either experiment this on the Windows platform or the Linux platform. It works on both. So I'll go ahead first to the Linux Mint. And in order for me to do this, I would need to turn off the machine. So I'm going to go ahead and shut down the machine. So now in order for us to add the GPU to this virtual machine, we need to edit the settings. The first change we need to do is we need to reserve the memory. And that's the change you need to do with the PCI through devices. You need to allocate memory in advance, which is also called pre-allocation. So in order for us to do this, we need to modify the RAM and bump it a little bit because 6 gig is no longer enough. You need additional memory when you have GPU pass-through. So for example, I will move this to 10 gig and I will reserve it for the memory. It will be locked, so it will show that we are using 10 gig already at all time. So this is a requirement. And then we will add from here PCI device. We'll do this twice because we have two devices that run in the GPU. We have the GPU itself and we have the high definition audio. So we should be good to go. Now let's save and let's see if we can run the machine as is. So now let's verify if the GPU is actually recognized by the system. There is a simple command for this, which is list PCI. List PCI would show you all the components in the Linux system. As you see in here, it's recognizing the VGA compatible controller, NVIDIA 1060 6 gig, and also the high definition audio controller. So if you want to do any graphics work on this virtual machine, you can simply do the pass-through setup and use your GPU inside the virtual machine. Now, as you see, it's very simple to do it with the Linux systems. And now I want to show you how to do the same with the Windows platform as well. So let's go ahead and shut down this machine to make sure that we are able to pass the GPU to a different VM. And then let's go into the virtual machines again. And let's register a VM. The Windows installation is a little bit different. We are actually using an OVF or OVA file, which is a more simpler way to deploy the virtual machine because the system is already pre-installed. We're just going to be loading it and using it right away. The only thing we have to do in here is just upload the very large file, which is around 22 gigabyte. I'm going to click next. I'll call this virtual machine Windows. And using the Windows virtual machine from Microsoft website, I will upload the OVF and the virtual machine disk file. I will just drag and drop them into the ESXi host client and click next. This one will also be stored in the SSD. And in here, it allows you to choose this network mapping. So you can choose host only, NAT. I will connect this to the zone 2 as well. Simply open the recent task in here where you can see all the upload stats for these two files. And now the files have been uploaded. So first I want to go to manage hardware and I just want to make sure the GPU is showing active again. So now that means there is no restriction on it from the previous VM, which is the Linux Mint. So now the VM had already started. So in order for us to modify the settings for the VM, we need to turn it off first. Now we'll go ahead into the edit section. Now under the CPU, make sure you disable the hardware nested virtualization. So we would not want to allow the virtualization to be passed through to this operating system while we have a GPU connected. Also for the memory, we need to increase this from 4 gig to something above 8 gigs. So I'll choose 10 gig as well and reserve it all for the operating system. And finally, I want to add the PCI devices, one for the GPU and one for the audio controller, which you will see in here, it was already pre-selected. So now let's save the virtual machine and let's turn it on again. Now, in order for us to verify if the GPU is read by the operating system, we need to go into the device manager. And in the device manager, you should see in here the GPU, but it still has no driver. And as you see, in a few seconds, the operating system already updated the GPU directly without having to download GeForce or any software. We are able to do the pass-through to the Windows and the Linux platforms as well. The experience here is very good. You will feel like this is a remote desktop connection. The lag is very minimal and the system works very well for a virtual machine hosted on a remote server. Now I will go back to the performance monitoring. As you see in here for the CPU, over the last hours, the only option we have, I'm able to see the load during all these virtual machines that we installed. You'll see also the memory usage over time, the network bandwidth over time, and the disk operations over time. So this is the power of ESXi platform. Let me know in the comments section what do you think about the ESXi platform, and also let me know if you have any questions. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.